Well, hello again and welcome back to the channel. This is, as of February 2025, my all-time top 10 best road legal Lotus cars. Now, I have spent far too long agonising over what should be in this list, and ranking the final 10 contenders in order was even harder. I decided that it was best if I limited this to Lotus cars that I had driven. So there are some major omissions of cars that I would dearly love to drive that I think probably would make this list if I had driven them. So equally, this list and the order of preference is subject to change, I think, as I drive some more of my dream Lotus cars. But as of now, February 2025, this is my top 10. The thing that all these 10 cars have in common is that these are the cars that had the biggest impact on me when I drove them. Now, of course, most, if not all, Lotus cars are great to drive in their own way, which is precisely what made it so hard to come up with a final top 10 cars that really stood out as exceptional driving experiences, even by Lotus standards. So please let me know your top 10 in the comments, or if you find it too hard, as I have, a top 5 or even top 3 would do. I'd be interested to see that, along with your thoughts on my list in the comments. So here we have a car that's very much of its time, and I think the significance and importance of this particular car has been lost a little bit over time. I think it was superseded by later four-cylinder Lotus cars, but it remains an absolutely seismic moment in my car history. It was my first Lotus that I'd driven, the first Esprit that I had driven. It was my first supercar, and it was the first of 3 Esprits that I have owned to date. So perhaps there is an element of rose-tinted spectacles, but the impression this car left on me at the time was pretty mind-blowing. Now, when it was launched in 1989, it was considered an absolute rocket. You have to remember that the Ford Sierra Cosworth of the day had 204 horsepower. This had another 60 on top of that. The 2.2 litre turbo revved 1,000 RPM higher than the Ford Cosworth. It was a much smoother engine as well, and at the time it felt like a spaceship, like a complete next generation of turbo car, which introduced the performance car world to air-to-water intercooling, which Lotus called charge cooling. It's a very efficient type of intercooler that was still being used in the last of the line Elise, Exige and Evoras, and in fact still used in the Emira today. You also have to remember that the Turbo SE was a movie star at the time. It featured very heavily in Pretty Woman and also Basic Instinct, which were 2 of the biggest movies of the early 90s. It was something of a sales hit for Lotus as well at the time. They made over 1,600 of them. That made it much more popular than the Esprit S4 that succeeded it and the S4S combined. But you wouldn't know it today. I have no idea where they all are. They rarely come up for sale and don't seem to generate a great deal of excitement when they do. The rarer high wing version does seem to have a bit more of a following perhaps. But the Turbo SE remains something of a forgotten Lotus. But it won't be by me. I had some fantastic drives in my Turbo SE in Scotland in particular, and also trips to the south of France and a trip to the Nürburgring, where we got there, the track was shut and I had to sleep in the car. I would expect the later S4S version to be better in every way, but until I get to drive one, the Turbo SE is my very fondly remembered number 10. Now, coincidentally, the mighty Lotus Carlton was the car that replaced my Esprit Turbo SE. And again, I have some very vivid and treasured memories of what the car was like in the 1990s. It was, of course, quite a controversial car in its day, but not perhaps for the reasons you might expect. I don't remember anyone complaining about the car's curb weight at the time. You have to remember that the Lotus performance through lightweight religion was really reignited by the Elise in 1996. In the early 90s, curb weight was just not a selling point, not even for Lotus. If anything, a light curb weight was associated with being flimsy and insubstantial. So I don't remember any controversy about the Lotus Carlton being too heavy for a Lotus, or indeed that they so wholeheartedly embraced a performance through horsepower approach with this car. Because while I do remember it being a very nicely balanced chassis back in the day, the steering also had a degree of delicacy to it. The standout feature that everyone remembers of this car is totally outrageous performance. Lotus did not pass up the opportunity to make a huge statement with GM investment. They pushed General Motors way beyond any ambitions of creating the world's fastest saloon. This car was genuinely one of the fastest cars you could buy. There must have been some proper coffee-spitting moments when the Lotus Carlton was announced at BMW and Mercedes. At Porsche too, their 964 Turbo was not even close to this four-door Opel/Vauxhall saloon. And famously, the much more expensive Ferrari Testarossa had similar power and weight, but was down on torque by a whopping 60 pounds-foot. So I think the Lotus Carlton will always be remembered as coming from a time when Lotus went unusually berserk with the spec of a new car. It probably is one of their most lunatic moments, but I remember it as a very well developed and very refined car actually, and one of its party tricks was the ability to cruise at 120 miles an hour at just over 2,500 revs in sixth gear, thanks to its Corvette ZR1 gearbox, which offered 44 miles per hour per 1,000 revs in sixth. And I would argue makes the Lotus Carlton the greatest Lotus GT car still to this day. Other things that I remember well were the suitably epic throttle pedal, which was like a large plate compared to most throttle pedals, a large steel plate covered in a black abrasive substance. It felt fantastically meaty as you pushed it into the carpet. The subsequent almost lag-free turbo thrust was smooth, linear and progressive, and just did not let up until well past 6,000 RPM. I remember the ever-present menacing deep bass rumble. It wasn't particularly tuneful at higher revs, but there was an ever-present deep bass note coming out of those square-shaped exhausts. I can remember the first time I ever lapped the Goodwood circuit was in my Lotus Carlton, but it was being driven at the time by ex-Formula One driver Peter Gethin, when it was at the time when the 355 Ferrari was a new car. So I think it must have been 1996 or thereabouts, a time when the F355 was considered the latest and greatest V8 Ferrari. Chris Rea was actually there in his 355, which was new to him at the time, and he was tearing around the track. Now, I can remember the Carlton moving around a lot on circuit. It was very softly sprung by modern car standards. Bearing in mind it was never intended to be a track car, I think it surprised everyone by doing the same lap time as the 355. The figure that I remember was a 1 minute 40, which again was shocking for a Vauxhall saloon. But that's what the Lotus Carlton did. It shocked the world in the early 90s, and it's my number 9 all-time great Lotus road car. So number 8 is my second Esprit in the list, and a car that's very close to my heart, the 1981 dry sump turbo Esprit. Now this is a car that could make it into the top 10 list just on Giugiaro's masterful lines alone. But unlike the previous two cars, this was a car I came to later in life. I didn't drive a Giugiaro Esprit until 2013, but this absolutely was my childhood dream car, especially with the Panasonic roof stereo, and even 32 years after it was made, it did not disappoint. What it must have been like in the early 80s is hard to imagine, but it was a deeply impressive and enjoyable car to drive for every one of the 7 years I was fortunate to own it. Now I can quite see how someone might put this car at the very top of their top 10 list, especially in the Essex Petroleum livery of the launch version of the car. I think this car was probably the closest Lotus ever really got to actually beating the equivalent Ferrari of the time. There was very little that you could say the 308 did better. I still think it's probably overall the best interior that Lotus ever did, especially with that aircraft-inspired roof stereo, but the ride was absolutely exceptional and it made it a genuinely comfortable car to cover miles in. But magically this did not come at the expense of its cornering ability. It had a beautifully balanced chassis as well, and I'd argue it was the first supercar that could really handle properly and feel good around corners. I'm convinced the much smaller, lighter 4-cylinder turbo was critical to this. A sweet handling balance was completely unusual in the early 80s. Most mid-engine cars were spiky and difficult, and the Porsche 911 of the time was known as being absolutely treacherous. That Citroën SM gearbox was probably the nicest shift that ever went into an Esprit. Certainly of the Esprits that I've driven. The other huge achievement of this car that seems to go unnoticed and never mentioned by other YouTubers is the work that Lotus did to eradicate turbo lag. Now in 1981 you could be forgiven for expecting this car to have horrendous turbo lag. And I can honestly say I was slightly disappointed when I first drove it, because some comedy turbo lag was going to be part of the appeal of having an early turbo car. With their first attempt, Lotus really did make a car that felt like a powerful, normally aspirated car, with one of the smoothest and most linear power deliveries you could imagine. Of course, it's not searingly fast by modern standards, and the brakes were definitely showing their age, but that cami motorsport gurgle, gravelly hiss and wastegate flutter was always a joy to hear chattering away over my shoulder. Absolutely one of the all-time great Lotus road cars for me, and I don't think it ever looked better than it did in 1981 on those 15-inch compomotive wheels, which remain the prettiest 15-inch wheels ever seen on a car. So here at number 7 we have another Esprit, but not one that I ever owned, unfortunately. I did own a V8 GT Esprit, but I was also fortunate to drive the Sport 350 on a few occasions, including a lap of the Nürburgring, and it was plainly better than the V8 GT in every way. It's the ultimate V8 Esprit for me, but for reasons that remain mysterious, it never really emerged from the shadow of its 4-cylinder Sport 300 predecessor. With a lot more power and torque, it was quite a bit rarer too, with only 42 cars made compared to the 64 Sport 300s produced. Yet for whatever reason, I would expect a Sport 300 Esprit to be worth more today. All of which goes to show just how much the Sport 350 remains overlooked and unappreciated, but my first drive in a Sport 350 was an absolute wow moment. Bearing in mind I had a V8 GT Esprit at the time, which was a car I absolutely adored, I was pretty shocked to feel how much faster the Sport 350 felt, given that claimed power and torque outputs were identical. The only difference Lotus claimed was that there was extra torque allowed in first and second. Now the V8 GT was already a seriously rapid car, faster overall I think than 350 horsepower would suggest. My car had no problem dealing with Ferrari 360s on track days. So to feel the extra performance of every aspect of the Sport 350 was really impressive at the time. Aside from the immediately obvious stronger acceleration, the braking feel and performance was much improved and better able to withstand track day abuse. The seats were both much more supportive and more comfortable, and for me still the best seats ever fitted to an Esprit. But it was the damping that was really next level. To this day I have never driven a car that could glide over the curbs at the Nürburgring in the way the Sport 350 did. It remained so beautifully composed and confidence inspiring no matter how hard you pushed it on track. Yet outright grip, response and turn-in was all improved over the V8 GT that I owned. Ride comfort somehow was even better too. There was a real plushness to the ride, and it remains one of the best examples of Lotus ride and handling mastery that you will ever drive. The gearbox was absolutely the car's Achilles heel, and I think the extra torque in the lower gears exposed that weakness further. But the occasional gearbox rebuild is, I think, a small price to pay for what must be the best driving and fastest Esprit of them all. Now, anyone familiar with my channel will know what a big fan I am of the Evora Sport 410. The Evora 400 with added lightness was the car that really sold me on the Evora platform. Up until then I was absolutely dedicated to the Exige way of doing things. My plan was to end up with the last of the Exige V6s, whatever that was going to be, but the Evora Sport 410 completely derailed that plan, and I still have an Evora in the garage to this day as a result. As it happens, I actually placed an order for an Evora Sport 410 shortly after driving it at the Castle Combe race circuit. It was going to be in copper fire with for your eyes only decals in gold and the optional Öhlins dampers. However, this was right before the GT430 was announced. I swapped my order over and the rest is history. So this was a car that made a major impression on me when I first drove it. Now, I was impressed with the Evora 400, particularly with the noise it made. It was the most outrageous sounding Lotus I had ever driven. But it wasn't enough to get me out of my Exige V6 Cup, but the Sport 410 absolutely was. And no, that had very little to do with the extra 10 horsepower. The Sport 410 remains a lesson in the benefits of removing 80 kilos out of the car, especially when you do it from all the right places. In this case, centre of gravity was improved, weight distribution was improved, driving position was improved, and that was just from the seats alone. But it was the extra ability on track that really won me over, especially as it came with little to no penalty in terms of road manners. In fact, the extra levels of communication and involvement only added to the enjoyment of driving it on the road. If anything, it actually left the factory with a slightly more playful chassis balance than the mighty Evora GT430, which was focused more on maximising mechanical and aero grip. So the Sport 410 remains a very special and intoxicating car to drive, even with a GT430 in the garage. And the value for money they represent today, if you can find one, is astonishing. It was always so much more than an Evora 400 with 10 more horsepower, and so much rarer with just 25 cars built for the UK. So, unlike the previous cars in the list, the Evora Sport 410 is well documented on my channel. You can actually watch most of the great drives I've had in it, and you can see the car working its magic on me in real time. But given we are at 20 minutes already and we are only halfway there, I have decided to split this top 10 list into two videos. So we conclude with the Evora Sport 410 in at number 6. And while the precise order and ranking of the cars is open to much debate, these were the cars that left a lasting impression on me, and cars which dished out an abundance of driving pleasure, thrills and engagement, second only to the 5 cars featured in the next video, which I shall be uploading next week. But please do share in the comments your top 5 or top 10, and feel free to make some predictions about what is coming up in my next video. I will be very surprised if anyone gets them all right. Until then, thanks as always for watching.